Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Highlights. I'm here with Mel Deziel of storyfuel.co. Mel, how are you?
I'm good. Hanging in there, right? We all are.
Uh, well, Mel's a new mama, and she is just an absolutely phenomenal person. She is the author of the Content Fuel Framework. She is a former New York Times trained media journalist. She is the CEO of Story Fuel, an incredible keynote speaker. I saw you, or I didn't get to see you actually at Social Media Marketing World because we were both speaking at the same time. But everything from your session, the feedback that I heard was phenomenal. And just we run in the same circles. I just think all your work is fantastic. And you wrote a book about how to generate unlimited story ideas. So for today, we'd like to talk more about what that looks like. I mean, when we're on lockdown and we're in quarantine and we're in COVID times, how many times can we post our same morning breakfast, right? We need your framework more than ever. So
Yeah.
for people that are listening, where do they start if they feel like they're posting Groundhog Day type content, or they're hitting a wall and they're seeing that cursor and they're thinking, okay, what is this framework and how can I use it?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the problems that I think all of us experience. Is like, I always say we need diverse input to have diverse output, right? Like you need new things to take pictures of, you need new experiences to share. And so it's definitely a much bigger challenge when we're all hunkered down at home for the most part. But yeah, one of the things that can be really beneficial is, finding new ways to have those new inputs and new experiences outside of your physical self traveling. So that might mean listening to podcasts or audiobooks in genres you normally wouldn't, or watching stuff on Netflix that's not recommended by your algorithm. That's like something different you'd never experienced. Because I think when you experience something different or consume something different that way, it really can spark new ideas for you. So I'll give you a
Yeah.
really good example of that worked for me. Recently, I had a conversation about 2 months ago with a friend who's a photographer. And they were talking about adjusting their business amidst COVID and how they were shifting towards some stock photography. And that gave me the idea, why don't I put my book in some lifestyle stock photography and upload them as stock photos? And that wound up being a really excellent way for me to get hundreds of thousands of impressions on pictures that happen to include my book. I never would have thought of something like that if I weren't talking to a photographer who is talking about their line of work. So these different inputs can really be super helpful for thinking in new ways when we're not getting that much inspiration from our daily life. Talking to a photographer who is talking about their line of work.
I was trying to share us to my other Facebook page. Sorry, hold on one second. We'll cut that out of the podcast. Well, it's so smart, Mel. And so basically, it's like if you find yourself posting boring content, shake up your everyday, right? Find something that's more interesting to talk about. So where, like, what is the first step of your? I'm just going to share this. Hold on one second. Okay, I just shared it. Okay, we're back. Sorry. Okay, so tell us about the framework itself, because what you're talking about, making sure your inputs are more diverse will help with more creative outputs. But I love on page 9 when you talk about this very clear content idea equals focus plus format. I love how simple that little equation is. So you talking about the point of concentration, where it's like you have a very clear focus and then you kind of go from there. So can you help people understand where they would start with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you're exactly right. That's sort of like the formula that drives the book. And the idea is we don't really have language to talk about content ideas. And sometimes that's why it's hard for us to come up with them. We get hung up on, okay, I need something for Instagram, or I need a video idea. And that can kind of, box us into a corner, and we come up with stuff we don't feel really passionate about. So the idea is think of
Yeah.
the story you want to tell first, or the stories you want to tell first. And then you ask yourself, what's the best format to bring that to life? So the idea is these focuses are like different lenses through which we can tell a story. So we can tell a story through the lens of people, or through history, or through data, and then you can switch that and say, now that I know the story I'm going to tell through the lens of people, the people who are involved in the story, what's the best way for me to capture that and share it with others? Is it writing, video, audio, or something else?
And you're a big proponent about curated content and repurposing content across multiple platforms,
Yeah.
right? So how do we figure out where we should start? Like, let's say someone listening is like, okay, I'm really comfortable with live video. I'm happy to press the damn button, as our friend Brian Fanzo says. Happy to go live. But then when it comes to crafting those captions for a feed post or a blog post, that just gives them the upper lip sweat anxiety attack. So how do they figure out, the format that they are most comfortable starting with natively? And then how do they work backwards on repurposing it from there?
So I love that you said starting it natively, because I think that's exactly how I talk about it too. I always say that everyone has a first content language. It's the way you communicate through content that comes most naturally, that you're most fluent in, and that you're most comfortable in. So it's like the thing you jump to first. For me, since my background is journalism, like I always go to writing first. I can write a killer blog post or a book or an ebook or whatever way faster than I could like record and edit a single video. So that's always going to be my comfort zone. But obviously, to your point, like we need other formats. We need to adjust our content to fit in all these different contexts. So there's a couple different ways you can fill those gaps. So if you're creating content in one format, like live video, and you don't feel like you're able to connect to some of these other formats, the first thing you could do is look for people who can fill that gap. Is there someone else in your life, on your team, an assistant, a virtual assistant you can bring on who would be really good at looking at your content and adapting it to that other format, writing your show notes, writing your post captions, writing your email newsletter, whatever that might be. So you can definitely find a person. The other thing you could do is find a tool. So many times there is a tool or a piece of software or some other program that can help you bridge the gap from one to the other. So in a live video context or a video context, maybe you have that video uploaded to Rev or a similar service. It gives you a transcript, and now you can cut from that transcript without having to write from scratch. You can actually pick out the best quotes and use that as your writing. So there's almost always going to be either a talent or a tool that you can use to bridge the gap between one format and another.
Yeah, I love that. I think it was Jill Scheffelbein, our mutual friend, who told me that I think she wrote one of her books using Rev. I think she just spoke, like she was more comfortable talking than writing. So she just basically went on and spoke for hours and transcribed it. And that was the beginning of her book. So I think that's great. So the first thing that if you're listening so are you more comfortable on camera or are you more comfortable pen to paper is a great first step to figure out where you should be starting, right? And then when we think about, so let's talk about content wise with things being Groundhog Day. Okay, so we can change up what we're watching. We can change up what we're making. How about how we take the different stories that maybe are sort of our signature stories? We had those cornerstone 5 or 6 stories, like for my MLM listeners, they talk about their before and after experience. They talk about, a challenge they were facing financially or emotionally and how they overcame it. They talk about a fear they experienced. They kind of have these 3 to 5 narratives that they kind of go back to every time. So how can we find new angles from the same story? For example, let's say I'm telling a story about I was so afraid to try a new opportunity with a company because I thought there was a stigma around these companies of everyone reaching out and saying, hey girl, in DMs and bugging you about skincare. And I didn't want to be one of those people. But then once I jumped on board and realized what was possible, I'm totally drinking the Kool-Aid now because it's really changed my life. So they tell that story. What would be a good way for them to figure out new ways of dusting off the sameness and maybe finding new angles?
Definitely. So I think when we look at the focuses that are listed out in the book, what I like to suggest is using it almost like a checklist to say, can I tell this story through this lens? So the first one, for example, is people. So it sounds like many of your listeners are probably already telling a people-focused story about themselves, but perhaps they can find another individual that they can use to tell a different version of that story, someone else's reason for joining, someone else's before and after, to kind of mix it up a little bit. Another one that we talk about is history. History is a really cool focus because it allows you to look back instead of projecting to the future. And so sometimes we can sort of dig deeper into our own background, the history of the company, the history of our interaction with those people. Maybe you're talking about this and you realize, oh, I remembered when my mom was an Avon lady or a Tupperware sales lady, when I was a kid, and the great community she built with the women around her. You can look back to history and try to find relevant stories that happened before that story began. Another one is data. Data is one of my favorites. So asking what are the numbers associated with this. So I know in the MLM space, it's obviously important. People want to know how many customers can you have? How much money can I make? Like there's a lot of calculations going on in people's
Sure.
heads. So by approaching the story through that lens, this is how much I invested to get started. This is how much I made during the first few months. This is what my average, some of that stuff may feel vulnerable to share. But sometimes that's really compelling. People seeing
Yeah.
actual numbers can be way more compelling than just sort of generalities and saying like business is good. Well, how good is good? And is your good the same as my good? Like I want some numbers here.
Yeah, no, I love that. And it's so important to, I think the word that you use is like vulnerable and that authenticity, because I think a lot of times the content that stops our scroll and the content that we actually lean forward and engage with is the content that from the publishing side does give you that little bit of a flutter. Like
Yeah.
it's that line, right? It's like skiing. Like you want to ski fast enough that you're having a good time, but not so fast that you're out of control and tumbling down the mountain. So same thing. You don't want to be TMI where you're one of those where they're like, okay, she went there. Okay, great. Good for you. Right. But you also don't
Yeah.
want to be this vanilla, everything to everyone, nothing to no one person. So how do
Yeah.
you personally walk that line between vulnerable and whoa girl?
So one of the things that can be really helpful, and this is
Yeah.
helpful for your content, for building your personal brand, and even just for the way you interact with people in your everyday life, is having an understanding of where your own boundaries are. Really be serious about it, not in a vague sense, but in a very specific sense. So, there are some people on social media who never share photos of their children, right? They don't even acknowledge that those children exist. It's a privacy thing. That's good for them. There are other people who share photos of their children, but only where their face is obscured or they never mention their names for their own privacy. And then there are other people who are just kind of out there with their kids, right? You may have a similar experience, whether that's where you live. I want to show you my neighborhood, or I want no one to know exactly where I live.
Yeah.
I want to share my personal health challenges, or I don't want people knowing my personal health information. I want to tell you my birthday, so you send me a birthday card / I don't want anyone to know how old I am, right? Everyone has their own boundaries. So it's really helpful to go through some of those common types of information we share, personal, family, health, financial, right? And decide where your comfort levels are and your boundaries are, because that's going to help you realize, okay, I'm getting close to that edge. So I know that I don't want to go much further, but I'm okay to share about it in a vague sense.
Yeah, it is a hard line to figure out what your boundaries are. I'm working on my book right now, and there are all the best stories where my publisher is like, "Yes, this is the good stuff." I'm sweating through my Spanx because I'm like, if this person, like, I need to get approval from my mother and my cousin and my bestie to share these stories, because it's like, well, stories about people, how's it going to make them feel? Or even really vulnerable stories, are people going to judge you? But we know that the more a story is oftentimes the most compelling, and it's the one that does actually garner that reaction.
Well, yeah, one of the things that we always say, and this is true from a testimonial or a customer service perspective, is if one person says it, there are often a lot more people who are feeling it but didn't say it. And so sometimes it may feel super scary to share, like, hey, this is something I'm struggling with. But oftentimes what you find is so many people are like, thank you. I've been struggling with that too. I thought I was alone. I really relate to you. Like, I'm drawn to you because now we have this shared experience. And I know for me, I've been seeing this a lot lately, that a lot of my friends who are also parents, especially parents of young children, we've hit a point where we're starting to share what a struggle it is to be trying to work from home while also caring for a kid. And I think the first few months of lockdown, all of us were kind of keeping that. We didn't want to admit that we were having trouble. It seemed like a scary thing, a weakness, a vulnerability. And then you hit a point where you're like, I need help. Like, we got to talk about this. This is a problem, And the more you open up, you find other people who are dealing with that same struggle. You can share a connection with them. You could share resources and ideas. So that kind of vulnerability, like you said, sometimes that's the thing that really draws someone into your story and into what it is that you do.
It's so true. And I think if people are listening are like, I don't know if I'm ready for that, there are all kinds of ideas in Mel's book for places you can start to dip a toe in the water of not just always being a storyteller where you're the hero of the story, but you can be a story seeker. And she has 10 focuses. She has people, basics, details, history, process, curation, data, product, example, and opinion. I mean, there are 10 different places that you can start where it's not tell us your most deepest, darkest secret, right? It doesn't have to always be
Yeah.
where we're the hero and we're in focus. There's so many other places to start. And I think that, being a story seeker and finding those stories, you can start to become more comfortable with what it feels like to share those moments. My question for you, so my background, I'm Irish. So my family, I come from a long line of, we call it blarney, but I think it kind of means like exaggeration and adding details and telling very elaborate stories. Like there was 100 people and the fire breathing dragon, but there were like 2 people and it was a dog, right?
Yeah.
So where do you stand on the adding the color that makes great stories great?
That's like my dad every time he goes fishing. Like the fish was always this big and his arms are like as wide as possible,
Like
right?
never let the truth get in the way of a good story, but
Yeah.
that's not what we want to be preaching. So how do we figure out if we're adding color for fun or when we're kind of like, okay, this is going on the internet, people can fact check this. Like,
Yeah. So I think that's where you do draw the line is what's truthful and what's in service of the story, right? Because those
okay.
are kind of two very close but slightly different questions. So to
Yeah.
your point about truth, like you don't want to lie about where you were. You don't want to lie about when something happened, particularly if that changes the understanding of the story.
Yeah.
If you are telling a story that would otherwise be too long, so you need to condense 2 conversations with a person into 1 conversation, well, that person did say those things and they did say them to you in a conversation, but perhaps it's in service of the story to shorten it up a bit and only share certain parts of it or make it as if it were part of 1 conversation instead of 2 days back to back, right?
Mm-hmm.
So those are the 2 things to consider is like, is this truthful? Like objectively, if it's fact checked, is it truthful? And then what's in service of the audience when I convey this story? Because that's often what helps us realize, well, this detail isn't really necessary for the story. I don't have to tell them all about it. When I shared that, the parents were all sharing the struggles we're having, I didn't give you a minute by minute rundown of my entire day's schedule. Like that would have been excessive. You don't need to know all that to understand the story, right? So it's understanding what does the audience need to know for this story and what's the level of detail they require. And so if you're asking those 2 questions, it usually becomes pretty clear, like where you can pinch things in and where you have room to expand them out a little bit.
Yeah, that's so good because I love different little story phrases. I mean, I tell very long stories. My husband's always like, land the plane, bring it home, because I'm just like, and then he's like, oh my God. So I'm always trying to shorten things up. And this one phrase, I think it was our mutual friend, Mike Ganino, gave me this phrase where I was like, how do I get it all in, but make it shorter and land the plane? And he said that one of his favorite phrases is one thing led to another. Like one thing led to another is a great way to like sort of take and then and bring it home. So do you have any other phrases that you lean on or that you like to rely on to kind of move it forward faster without play by play?
Yeah, definitely. So, and it depends on the kind of language you use with your audience. One thing led to another is great. It's very casual. So if you're having kind of a casual conversation, it works. And if you're in more of like a, like suit and tie businessy context, you could say like the net effect of this was, and then you kind of just like sum up the outcome at the end of the day, right? Or at the end of the conference, the conversation, the struggle is another good one.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I like to do is sometimes I just sort of stop in the story and I'm like, the real lesson of the story here, the real moral of the story, or what I learned, you just kind of acknowledge like this could really go on. And you just kind of pause in whatever form, video, writing, ... whatever it is. And you're like, but here's the thing, like, this is what I learned from this gigantic experience, this whole ordeal. You just like acknowledge the length and then shift to the lesson.
That is so good. I love that. You're like, just stop telling it and get to the point. It's so good.
Yeah.
That's so good. So I feel like, when a lot of us are putting together our story, whether we are speakers or authors or writers or entrepreneurs, because our journeys are winding and long and there's a lot of details. So when you tell your story, for example, like if someone was going to say, Mel, tell us about how you became the CEO of Story Fuel, or how did this become your thing? Like, do you have a story about becoming a storyteller? Okay. Can we hear it?
Yeah, I can. But see, so what I want to stress here is that for me, I'm a former journalist. So that's really where my background starts at the very beginning.
Okay.
But what that taught me is that the story is actually more about the audience than it is about you.
Mm-hmm.
So the way I would tell that story is very different depending on who the audience is. If I'm speaking to students, I'm going to focus way more on how I got started and how I got each of those jobs and how I made the decision and the mentors that I relied on, right? The things that they can learn most from. If I'm talking to a colleague, I don't need to provide all that detail about how I got a job. I'm just going to say, well, I started here and then I moved here and now I'm doing this. If I'm talking to someone who's a client, I'm not going to focus so much on the past. I'm going to tell my story with more of an angle toward the future, where we're working together, where I'm helping them. So that's one thing to think about, is less of having one set script that you stick to, and more having like a full menu of points in your story and selecting the ones that are most appropriate for your audience at any given time. And, this is to your point earlier about selecting the truth, because you tell a story a different way or present it a different way doesn't necessarily make it less truthful. So I'll give you a good example. You've had a crazy weekend with your pals. This is the pre-COVID time. So, you guys were all out, no holds barred, right? Your best friend texts you, they couldn't make it. And they're like, how was your weekend? You're going to give them all the detail. It's going to be dramatic. It's going to be exciting. You're probably going to use colorful language. When you finish texting with them and your grandmother calls you and goes, oh, how are you doing, sweetheart? How was your weekend? You're going to tell that story in a very different way, right? Your grandmother doesn't need all that detail. You want to kind of keep out some of the details that are not grandma safe, right?
You were at church. Yeah.
Well, if you weren't, right? If you weren't, that wouldn't be truthful. But maybe with your friends, you'd say, I spent the weekend with some friends. I caught up with some people I haven't seen in a long time. We had a whole lot of fun. Right? You'd sort of condense it down to, this is what she needs to know. She's not asking for every detail. She's asking, did you have a good weekend? Right? So it's okay to change the way you deliver information to best suit the audience.
I love that. It's so genius because persuasion is personal. And I talk about this all the time. And it's so much easier to be a coach than a player sometimes when you know a fact to be true, but then when you're walking in the shoes, it's tricky. So let's say, for example, you're speaking to a group of authors and thought leaders and speakers, and someone said, tell us a little bit about how you got into becoming a storyteller. What would be the version for that versus the version for, like you were saying, if you're talking to a bunch of students?
So the version I would share there is probably that I started out as a journalist, and I always thought I would end up at a newspaper or a website somewhere telling breaking news stories, in-depth stories about people who we should know about and don't. And what I found is that my skills were actually much more valuable at that time on the marketing side, that there were a lot of brands who were trying to connect with audiences through storytelling, and they just didn't have the training or the know-how to be able to do that efficiently. So I made the transition from reporting and journalism to brand content. I use many of the same skills, interviewing people, finding stories, creating content on deadline, and then I leveraged my experience in marketing to help get that content out to the right people. And this is still really valuable to me because my mission is education. I love helping people learn new things. And as a journalist, that means telling them about events they may not have gotten to see. And, as a brand content creator, it means telling them about people and places and products that they may never have had a chance to know about otherwise. So my mission is still aligned. I'm just working for a different purpose.
So good. It's so perfect. So then if you were talking to students, how would that story change?
Yeah, so that story would be different. I would say, so I first started out in undergrad. I studied investigative reporting. I was very involved in my student newspaper. I had a number of different internships, and I might give some detail about those. I went on to graduate school where I studied arts and cultural criticism. I wanted to balance out the science with the arts. But when I graduated, it was the middle of a recession. All these newspapers were downsizing. There were not that many jobs. I always make the joke with them, like I got the two least employable versions of a journalism degree, investigative and arts and culture, which are the two first teams that get cut. So I had to figure out, like, what can I do with my journalism degree, but if I can't work in journalism? And that's when I realized that there was a need for these skills. And the story from there may be quite similar, because once I'm out in the job market, but I'm going to set it up differently because that's the part that's most relevant to them. What did I do in school? How did I get out into the job market? How did I get the jobs that I got?
Oh my God, Mel, that was awesome. That was a great, specific contrast to see the difference in action. That's fantastic. I love that. So when you think about people that are hitting the writer's block, let's say they're going through your framework, but it's just one of those days where you just feel like you're out of ideas. So the brainstorming process that you describe in this book, you have an actual grid that you can have people go through. It's on page 170, I think.
Oh,
Oh,
that
which one is it? Oh, which one?
There's one
Let's
on
see.
17, I think.
Oh yeah, there's one even earlier. Yeah, that's right. I'm sorry, you're right. On page 17, right here, if you guys can see the screen. And for those of you listening to the podcast, I will link to Mel's book as well as her Content Fuel Framework workbook you can get with code HIGHLIGHT at contentfuelframework.com/workbook. But here she has this incredible grid where she has all those topics at the top that we talked about. And then down the left side, it's every single type of format. So infographics, image galleries, quizzes, timelines, audio, video, live video, all these different places. And you basically, I guess you just kind of go through and just bleh, right? All over the framework.
Yeah.
I mean, is that kind of that's the process, right?
Bleh all over the framework. I think I'm going to go update the description on Amazon, but yeah, basically, right. The idea is, so, you want to tell a story, again, for your MLM folks, it's your origin story. How did I get into this business? Right. So the idea would be you go through the list of the focuses and you say, can I tell this about people? Yeah, of course. I can talk about my story. I could talk about my mom's story, how she used to do this. I could talk about the friend who introduced me to it. I could talk about someone who had an amazing transformation that inspired me. So maybe those are your people focused ideas. And then the question would be, okay, what's the best way to bring those stories to life? Well, my mom lives far away, so probably not video, but I could probably do an audio interview with her if I wanted. The gal who introduced me to this, we Skype all the time or FaceTime all the time. So we can do a video interview with her, right? Then you go on to the next focus and you say, okay, basics. What are the basic things people need to know about this story? The basic thing they need to know about what it is that I do. That might be a tutorial. It might be, a single one pager, or you might put your information on like a baseball card with your key stats and facts. I don't know. But just sort of this idea of putting just the basic information or how to get started, if they're already interested. So that basic information. And then you ask that same question. What's the best format on this list of 10 to bring this to life? So if you just go down that list of focuses and each time you ask, what's the best format from this list to bring that story to life? I mean, the possibility is up to 100 ways to bring any individual story to life. And of course, the goal is not to tell every single story 100 different ways. That would be a lot. But it helps you think in different ways. It helps you think of combinations and formats and perspectives that you wouldn't think of otherwise. And that gives you more to choose from. So you're making the right choice, the best choice, a choice that excites you, and not just, I have no ideas today, and this is the first thing I thought of, and it was easy, so let's call it a day.
And that's the worst. The check the box contenting is the worst, because you feel like, first of all, you don't want to piss off the algorithm. So you don't want to go dark because then they punish you. So the other thing is you just feel like it's almost like you didn't work out today, or you didn't eat the vegetable, or you didn't call the mom, or whatever is the thing that you just need to check off the list for the day. But when you're just phoning it in on content, not only do you feel yucky and is it a kind of a waste of your valuable time and energy, but also on the consumer side, on the user, viewer, audience side, it's so obvious when someone's phoning it in. Like when people have auto-scheduled content and they're outsourcing it to the VA in another country, and they're just checking that box. It's such a lose-lose all around. So for those of you listening who are like, if I had nothing to say, should I just post anyway? Well, number one, get this content framework, because you'll always have something to say with the content. But number two, just phoning it in it's a waste of your time and it's not effective anyway, right?
Well, and one of the things that I think is really important is to remember that a lot of times that I don't feel creative thing, if you're having an off day and like, look, the world's in a freaking pandemic, like, people's families are sick, like we're in the middle of a crazy political season. Like it's possible to just have a bad day, and maybe you shouldn't work today. You need a mental health day. You need to work out, take a break, nap, whatever. You can allow yourself to do that, to have an unproductive day if you plan content in advance. So a big part of this framework is also you can generate several ideas that you can create and batch in advance, so that when you do have I'm not feeling it today, or something came up, or I've got a cold or something, and so I'm not going to be good on audio today because my nose is stuffy. Like, you've got something you already created that you can share in that slot. And then it's not so stressful to have an unproductive or uncreative day because you've got something ready to go. So that's another big way to relieve that stress, is plan and create in advance so that you've got something sort of in your back pocket for those days when you need it.
And that's such good advice. And it's so funny because planning in advance, it's really not as overwhelming as it might sound. I mean, you don't have to map out 90 days. I mean, we're talking, you could do a week in advance. You could do 2 weeks in advance. The only caution I would say for our listeners when it comes to planning in advance is just make sure you double check before stuff goes live in case something happens during the morning or the day. Because I know I had some friends that had some content scheduled when there was a tragedy that happened. I think it was like the volcano that erupted in New Zealand a couple of months ago, and they had this like a post about explosive something or other, but you have to just be careful of that. When you plan it, just double check to make sure what happened in the world today before it goes live.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the things I like to say is you don't necessarily want to schedule too far in advance for exactly that reason, but it is good to know that, like, okay, I've got maybe 10 or 15 Instagram posts where the images are already edited, the captions are already written, I already have the hashtags. And so when I'm planning in advance, or when I have to switch up what I thought I was going to post today because there was an explosion of a volcano, then you have something there and you don't have to fix it on the spot and require instant perfect creativity, right? You can pull on what you've already put the work in.
Yeah, it's so good. One of the things that I really loved, I mean, I loved your whole book. By the way, you can read this book. You can read this book I read it in about 2.5 hours. I mean, it's really doable.
It's a quick read.
It's an afternoon read, but there's so much content. It's more it's something where you want to mark down all these different places and come back to it because it's small but meaty, if you will.
Yeah. And we organize it that way on purpose, right? We want it to be something you can reference and write in the margins and flag it, because different parts of this are going to be more familiar and different parts of it are going to be newer and you want to spend more time with it. So it's designed to be a quick read, and it's organized to make that possible for you.
Yeah. And I love the 100 idea challenge, where you kind of challenge us to just start to build those bridges in our brain and dust off those moments. Cause it's like a muscle. That's what you talk about in the book. You're like, look, it's like doing reps or like working out. You just get better and better the more that you practice. So tell us a little bit more. I loved on page 164, you talk about content multipliers. And I love the idea that it's the work smarter, not harder, get more bang for your mental buck. So can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, so the content multipliers are like a secret weapon at the back of the book. These you can apply to any of the content you're creating for any platform, any format. The idea is when we have something that we know works or that we have a feeling will work, it's sometimes beneficial not to think of that piece of content as a tree that like grew really quickly and it's beautiful and we love it, but actually the trunk of a tree, and we can create branches off of it that are related content. So let's see. So if you were in the sort of skincare space, and those are the products you're sharing, then say you're going to do an article about skincare routine for the summer to prevent sun damage and drying out in the heat and all this, right? Now you might think, okay, that's great, that was awesome, now on to my next content idea. Or you can say, wow, I could do one for the fall, for the spring, and for the winter. So I could multiply that based on time. I could use the time multiplier to say this advice is actually different depending on the season. So I'm going to recreate it, for each of those different seasons. And that way I've turned one idea into 4. In other spaces, in fashion, for example, things change by the season, but they also change by the year, right? Trends change over time. So you can talk about what to wear to a Thanksgiving event, what to wear to a Christmas event, what to wear on a job interview. I mean, instead of just saying like your best day to night looks, well, doesn't it depend what you're doing at night and what you're doing in the day? So you can adapt that, right? So we share 4 multipliers in the book. Time is one, location is another. So this is especially helpful if you're in like the travel or hospitality space. Here's the best cruises in the Caribbean, the best European cruises, the best, other cruises in other places, to just kind of run through different areas. Another one is demographic. So the idea with demographic content, and again, we can come back to skincare. My guess is that your advice and the products you would recommend are probably different for a teenager, someone who's in their 20s, in their 40s, or is older, that you might want to adapt that by different age, right? Or maybe you want to adapt it based on people who have kids, or people who maybe are on birth control or not, because that could affect their hormones in their skin. people who are vegan because they're getting different nutrients. I don't know. I'm not a
Yeah.
skincare expert, but you know,
Yeah.
you're a
You sound
skincare
like
expert if you're listening.
it. Yeah.
And then the last multiplier is resources. So the idea with resources is sometimes our content adapts based on what tools or other resources people have. So as an example, maybe you want to do, here's a summer skincare routine under $200. Here's a summer skincare routine under $50, right? Because people have
Mhm.
different levels of resources. Or here's a 30-minute summer skincare routine, or here's a 5-minute summer sun care routine because I don't have time for that. I've got a baby. Like, I'm not going to sit in the bathroom for 30 minutes. So you can go through and adapt your content by looking for these multipliers: time, location, demographics, and resources to see if one idea, a skincare routine, a list of skincare recommendations, can actually sprout into all these different branches that appeal
Mhm.
to different sets of your customer base.
Oh my God, Mel, that is so mind blowing. I mean, this is so good. And I just love that it's something that you can use no matter if you're in sales or in marketing, or you're just someone that is looking to become better at journaling and doing your morning
Yeah.
pages. I mean, this is just a great place to start on so many levels. So I want to just elevate the conversation for a second beyond your book. And I would like to talk to you as a friend and as a professional storyteller.
Yeah.
What do you think we should be doing to better manage our story? So let's switch gears from creators to consumers. How do
Sure.
we better manage, in your opinion, um, all of the stories that we're being hit with on social media in this political season, in this time in 2020? This is totally off your book and this is totally off
Fine.
the topic, but just at
Yeah.
like friend to friend, personal question, how are you managing your content consumption?
So I think this is different for everybody.
Yeah.
One of the things I know, Erin, we were talking about is like, if you work in this space, it's really difficult to unplug. You can't get off of Facebook for a week or not go on Instagram when that's where your business comes from, or that's how
Mhm.
you communicate with your customers. So sometimes we have to find other ways to create self-care or create those boundaries for ourselves. So
Yep.
for me personally, one of the things that I recently did that has been a major change to my like mental health and general state of life throughout all this chaos
Go
is
on.
I moved all my social media apps to the second page of apps so that I have to actively choose to go see them. And I shut
Mm.
off notifications for them because look, I know I'm going to go check it. So I don't need to be interrupted every time I get a tag or a message. Like, we all know we're going to go look. We have to go look, right? But I don't need to be interrupted in all these moments. I don't need my phone to light up while I'm focused on time with my child or eating a meal or taking a shower. Like, I don't need to be pulled into it. I can make
Yeah.
that an active choice. So I shut off all the badges for the main apps that are on my homepage. So again, my email, I'm not getting told when I get an email. I know I'm going to check my email app
Yep.
14 times a day. So you don't need to tell me, you know? So
Yeah.
that was super helpful for me. So now I have no badges on my home screen. It's a place of calm instead of a place of being behind and overwhelmed by tasks.
Chaos. Yeah.
And then I have the second page has all my social media. That's like messenger apps, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, the whole shebang. And that way I know if I want that, if I'm ready, if I'm in a state where I want to do that, I can swipe and I can get right to it. But if I'm
Mhm.
doing something else, if I'm just going to call my mom, if I'm just going to, I don't know, enter in my, your workout in your fitness app, like, you don't need that to yell at you and give you homework when you're not ready. So
Yep.
for me, that separation has been a total game changer.
Oh, that's so good. And I'm curious. So, okay, so you're sort of managing what's being pushed to you, and managing notifications is huge. Let's talk about from a consumption side, which again, I know is not what we're talking about in your book, but I'm
Yeah.
just curious. As a journalist, as someone who comes from a space of trying to be fair and balanced and objective in this extremely tumultuous digital landscape, how do you
Yeah.
curate your news feed and your news sources and your story sources to make sure that you're not just reinforcing the opinion that you probably naturally have? Because a lot of people say unfollow and block and mute, but then you're only getting one side of the story. And if you want to be a great storyteller, I would assume elevating your story consumption is one way to make sure that you're getting multiple perspectives. So how do you curate what you consume so that it's more diverse and broad?
Yeah. So there's a couple ways to go about this. For me, I try to make sure that I'm following a diversity of perspectives. This probably requires you doing an audit. I got to be totally honest with you all. Like I audited the people I was following on Twitter, and I was ashamed by how white and male it was. Like it was severely
Wow.
lacking in diverse perspectives. And that was, of course, not intentional. It's just the kind of thing that happens over time when you're not
Hmm.
conscious of it. You keep seeing more of the same. They share more of the same. So you follow more of the same.
Yep.
So I made a conscious effort to seek out, and again, don't put that labor on other people. Seek out those diverse voices that are bringing new perspectives. So I spent a lot of time trying to find those people and bring them into my feed actively. One of the things we have to realize is that the algorithms are not working in our favor on this.
Hmm.
The algorithms are always going to show you more of the same and more of what you already like. The algorithm is always going to confirm what you believe. So if you want different inputs, you're going to need to go outside the algorithm. So the
Hmm.
best way to do this is to get human recommendation. So a good example, and I know we chatted about this before, is like I try to consume, documentaries, books, podcasts, movies, shows that are outside my normal genre. Like if you go on my Netflix, it's like, here's a nature show, here's Great British Baking Show. Like it's very calming, like non-stressful TV. But when I want to break out of that and consume something different, I know that Netflix is just going to give me Planet Earth Series 8. So I need to look somewhere else. So I asked for human recommendations from people with different interests. What are you watching? What is it recommending for you? Because I'm not going to see that recommendation. And to be in the culture, to be part of that conversation, I've got to know. So whether it's
Hmm.
music, podcasts, books, people on social media, go see who other people are following, go see what they're consuming and recommending, and try to, you have to take an active role in bringing those diverse perspectives into your feed if that's what you want to see.
Yeah, that's so good, Mel. And it's so funny that you're saying go outside the algorithm because I don't think people even really realize how much we are reliant on these recommendations because it's
Yeah.
easy. I mean, if someone says you might also like, it feels like it's a friend, but it's not. It's a machine, right? We have
Yeah.
to
Well,
remind ourselves. Yeah.
yeah, well, and I think it's also a comfort thing. Like, think about when you go to order out. If you're gonna order, you're gonna order in food. You know that this genre or this restaurant or whatever it is, like, I know I like Mexican food. I know I like tacos and nachos and burritos. So I'm just gonna order tacos and nachos and burritos from the
Yeah.
same place because it's comfortable and I know what I'm getting. It's
Yep.
a little bit, it's more of a risk, so to speak, to say, am I gonna invest my money or my time or whatever it is in this restaurant or this film or show or whatever else if I
Yeah.
don't know that I'm going to like it, right? So remember, the algorithms are not optimized to show you what you want. They're optimized to show you what they think you want. So if you
Hmm.
are going outside your normal patterns, you're just going to have to find another way to discover those things.
Yeah, yeah, and it's all about that search bar. I mean, really typing in search terms and not just in YouTube, for example, when you're on there and
Yeah.
it like don't click those ones on the right rail. Type in, seek out
Yeah.
independently content. One exercise that I did recently after watching The Social Dilemma, which is a whole other conversation, but I created 3 avatars, and I basically said like, who are 3 types of people, generalization types of people that I don't hang out with in real life, that I don't know very much about, that
Mhm.
is something that's totally out of my comfort zone. What do they look like? Maybe what do they watch? What do I think I know about them? And I literally went through and started searching. And to your point, like doing an audit, you have to do it independently of the algorithm, independent of the
Yeah.
algorithm. I went through and I searched for, different cultures and different places in the country. I mean, what are stay-at-home moms in the Midwest, consuming? What are, super progressive, Middle Eastern, I don't know, coastal city dweller. I create all these different personas and it was incredible. And I made this commitment to kind of find and replace. And at first, my knee-jerk reaction to seeing this type of content in my newsfeed was like, well, this isn't for me. Like my knee-jerk reaction was almost to scroll by. And I really tried to force myself to kind of eat your vegetables a little bit. And maybe you don't think you like
Yeah.
Brussels sprouts, but you don't know till you try and it's good for you. So, can you have the
Yeah.
courage to try it?
Well, and it's also like, let's be honest. Does anyone like brushing their teeth? Like, it's a thing you do because you're supposed to do it, but like, no one's passionate about brushing. I don't think so. If you are passionate about brushing your teeth, like, reach out, let us know. But for the most part, like it's something we know that we need to do and it's good for us, right? So like the eating vegetables thing, it may not be comfortable, it may not be fun, you may rather do something else with your time, but if you know that it's going to benefit you in the long run, both in, growing yourself as a person, opening yourself up to new ideas, getting new inspiration, connecting with new people, like then you just got to do it. Just brush your teeth.
Yeah, just brush your teeth. Hashtag just brush your teeth. That's
Yeah.
so good, Mel. Oh my gosh, well, you are so awesome. And I think the last question that I want to ask you before we kind of wrap up a little bit is, as someone who's consuming a lot of incredible content and stories and someone who has an incredibly rich network of thought leaders, who are you reading right now, nonfiction author, that you think we should go check out, buy their book, maybe have them on the podcast? Anyone come to mind that you're checking out lately that you're digging on?
Yeah. So, gosh, I'm going to have to look up the name to make sure I pronounce it right, which I'm going to do right now. But there's a book that I read recently that absolutely blew my mind. Okay. I'm going to try this. I'm doing my best. With all apologies to Carolyn. It's Carolyn Criado Perez.
Okay.
She wrote a book called Invisible Women: Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. So this book is all about the hidden things in our lives that you never thought about, but men designed them for men, and it's not serving us ladies the way we thought it might. So this is like my favorite example that blows everybody's mind. All those ratings for car safety?
Yes.
Like when they say increased survival rates, airbag help, they only use male dummies. No one is required to use dummies that have female proportions or shapes. So every rating you've ever seen for car safety only applies to men. And women die in the same kind of car accidents at an increased rate as a result. Ladies, you know what I'm talking about. You put that seatbelt on. You're like, why does this seatbelt land right here on my chest? This is horrible. This can't possibly be right. It's because it's male dummies that they're testing and placing seatbelts on. And it's the same reason pregnant women aren't able to fit into a seatbelt, because nobody thought of that. So, there's so many things like that in our world. And it really opened my eyes to these hidden instances where, our needs weren't taken into consideration in the same way. And I feel like it's made me a better person, a better consumer, a more informed person, and more understanding of some of them didn't apply to me, of course, but I don't personally wear bulletproof vests as a first responder, but knowing that women don't have bulletproof vests designed for them, and as a result, they're not protected the same way, like that's important for me to know as I'm having conversations, as a citizen.
Wow, Mel, I cannot wait to check that book out. That sounds awesome. And that is mind blowing. I had no idea about that fact. That is kind of scary. It's similar to how I felt when Sheryl Sandberg started calling out Getty Images and all the stock photos, where if you searched for, everyone in our industry knows there is this one woman that is the stock female speaker. If you search female keynote speaker, it's the same sexy librarian gal, and there's three of her. Yes, exactly. It's like, and if you search, male keynote speaker, there's pages and pages. So, I mean, It's just interesting whether it's, algorithms or stock images or data and research and where it's stemming from. There is so much work to be done on so many levels, and bringing awareness to that through data, through books like this one that you've been so kind to recommend. I mean, we all have to kind of roll the sleeves up and stay in the fight for this, because there's so much freaking work to still do. We've come a long way, and we have a long way to go. So good awareness reminder from you, Mel. Thank you so much for adding that link, and I'll put it in the show notes as well. Mel, you're totally awesome. Guys, if you want to check out Mel, she is at Mel Deziel on Instagram, right?
Yep.
And storyfuel.co. I will put the link to her Content Fuel Framework workbook with code HIGHLIGHT in the show notes. We'll also put the Invisible Woman Data World Designed book as well. And if you want to check out Mel, definitely give her a follow. This book is invaluable. Mine is marked up to the nth degree, and there are all kinds of fun prompts you can use. Cannot recommend it highly enough. So, Mel, you're totally awesome. Thanks for sharing all your brilliance with us today on the Highlights podcast.
Yeah, thanks for letting me share my story.
Great to see you.
You too.
Bye.